Now, what we're seeing here is the most powerful man or office in the world being powerless against the head of state of a small country.
Afzal, let's just start with the very latest coming out of Iran this morning. The Ayatollah has taken morning prayer, I believe, for the first time in 5 years. What do you think is the significance of that move this morning?
Well, I think the significance primarily is that the Ayatollahs want to show that they're not entirely in hiding, and that they have the support of the people. You see, a few days ago, Netanyahu was sending a message to the Iranian people that you'll be liberated by us very soon, and I think what this whole conflict, like many recent conflicts, is about uh, uh, a lack of understanding of the other side. Certainly, the Israelis are living in some form of a thought vacuum. They have constructed an image of Iran, which they use very effectively for propaganda purposes. And they assume that that image applies in reality. Now, it's very true that the Iranian regime is not particularly kind in many ways. It's pretty oppressive in many ways, and it has a huge amount of opposition within the country and outside the country. But when nations are attacked, as the Israelis have found, people come together. A friend of mine who is an ex-State Department official who grew up in Iran answered this question in a very similar way. She said that the moment you start to attack Iran, the people will come together, particularly if that attack comes from a country like Israel or the United States. So I think this whole event today was to say to the world, we're not what you think we are.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, we've talked for a long time about Gaza, haven't we? And, how the attacks will no doubt increase support for Hamas. We spoke to an expert on the World in 10 only yesterday about the Lebanese people, who many of them do not like Hezbollah's position within Lebanon, and yet they feel like the country is coming under attack. And so the feeling is slightly different. And yet, we've seen all these in the recent years, I guess, to talk about morality police in Iran and that kind of thing, and how it does appear to be a really sort of a country with two very distinctive sides. You think now, if Israel really steps up attacks on Iran, this is going to potentially give the Ayatollah and the ruling people within Iran a lot more power, a lot more strength to do as they please, I guess.
I think so. I think if you look at history, it's when nations feel what they perceive to be an extreme threat from the outside that they allow extreme responses. That's when extremist governments come into being. The Germans felt they were being treated extremely badly after the First World War, and by many accounts they were, certainly in terms of reparations and other things. And that's how the Nazis came into power. It's the same thing in other parts of the world. The Ayatollahs only came into power because of the extreme repression that the CIA-backed Shah regime had. They had a secret police service that was extremely repressive, and it was extremely repressive against the Iranian communists. And all the indications were that the Iranian communists would come into power during the revolution, and that is why the West helped Ayatollah Khomeini to come out of his villa in the south of France, flew him to Tehran, if you like, to lead the revolution, because he was considered the lesser of the two evils to replace the Shah. And I could go on. People forget that the reason Hezbollah it came into existence at all was because for decades Israel occupied Lebanon, and they caused enormous suffering and disorder, and there are a number of incidents where people have been killed. Some people describe them as genocidal incidents. Um, and these were overseen, some say facilitated and participated by the Israelis. So the feeling towards Israel in Lebanon and elsewhere is based on Israeli physical and violent attacks. Now, whether we think they're justified or not is a different question, but Israel will not have a huge amount of support, certainly not at the popular level around the region because of its former actions.
Yeah, I mean, all of this being said, you talked about the former actions. This escalation over the course of the last year, of course, did begin with the October the 7th terror attack in Israel by the Iranian-backed group Hamas. October the 8th then saw the Iranian-backed group Hezbollah firing missiles into Israel and the north of Israel. Do people not take that into account? Because all the media that you see around it says, well, Israel are defending themselves in the wake of those attacks. Is that either forgotten or just not accepted?
Well, you're touching a point that is really profound here, and it's the one, if you like, one of the biggest differences between the way the Western world, the Israeli, if you like, supporting world, and the rest of the world sees this. And one of the, I mean, all wars have a narrative component, and this war probably is much more led by the narrative. And the Israelis have, throughout their history, but particularly in this instance, have been brilliant at starting the clock from a particular point. The 7th of October is from where everything is now talked about, particularly in the Western media. But people don't see the 7th of October happening in a vacuum. They see the 7th of October as an explosion of a great deal of persistent injustice and violence committed against the Israelis. Now, that statement isn't there to justify the 7th of October. And I think a lot of people, certainly my knowledge is the majority of people would not condone the killing of innocents on either side. The innocents that Hamas killed in Israel, took hostage, that's not acceptable and that's not forgivable. But that doesn't justify the killing and imprisonment of thousands of children and adults. It doesn't justify 41,000 people, plus maybe 10, 20,000 whose bodies are buried, they can't be counted, and so on. So I think we have to be very careful. And I think you've actually hit on a significant point, that the 7th of October, if you start judging history, judging people from the 7th of October onwards, then you get, or you can construct a very significant narrative of events that is hugely supportive, or at least excuses or explains to a degree Israel's actions, particularly in terms of the incredibly high casualty rate. But if you look at things in a wider context, you will see a completely different picture. One of the associated narratives with this 7th of October, which is really comes to the point that we're talking about Hezbollah and Lebanon and Iran, is that Hezbollah has been pumping thousands of rockets since the 7th of October or 8th of October into Israel. That is a partial truth. How many people have been killed as a consequence of that? And how many rockets and how many artillery shells have gone the other way to provoke, if you like, those attacks? We only get a fragment of the information. We get a very selective view of what's happened. As far as I can tell, and I don't know the figures, a handful, maybe 6 people have been killed by Hezbollah's actions. Many times more have been killed by Israeli actions. And independent think tanks based in the US, according to them, 80% of the fire across the Lebanon border has been from Israel into Lebanon, not from Hezbollah into Israel. So, we're in a fact vacuum. We're in a selective and powerful narrative war. So I think we just need to, as journalists or as analysts, just be a little bit humble and critical about what the real factual situation is on the ground. And that one of the first things is not to take sides. We cannot take sides except the sides of the innocents on all sides of the conflict.
I I guess what I'm asking is, I mean, you're talking about it being the number of casualties from Israeli rockets. I guess that what I'm saying is, isn't it inevitable that Israeli citizens are effectively going to die less frequently because of the defensive capabilities of Israel?
If we say, well, you've only managed to kill a few of our people simply because we've got a better defensive capability, I'm not sure that actually is part of the entire, if you like, situation. If you listen to Hezbollah and indeed Iran, what they have said consistently is we do not target civilians. And so when we end up killing them, it is simply because very often it's because the air defense system has shot down the rocket and it's landed somewhere where it wasn't intended, or there's been an error with the rocket or with their targeting. That is very different. And I don't want to get into the war, into saying, well, one side is much more moral than the other. The point I'm trying to make is the narrative that is coming out of Israel and its supporters, and it's been broadcast on the BBC. In fact, 2 days ago, the Israeli ambassador to the UK said to the BBC that the intention of those 182 rockets was to target Israeli civilians. Now, as far as I'm aware, that is factually wrong. And Iran has said that we targeted 3 military air bases. We targeted the headquarters of Mossad deliberately, and we avoided civilian casualties. And one of the explanations given is one of the reasons for doing it at night was to minimize the likelihood of civilian casualties. And they seem to have been successful in this incident completely. And I think the only casualty was a Palestinian who died as a result of a rocket being shot down, I think, by the Jordanians. So the point I'm trying to make is that what in this game, the propaganda war, which paints the other side in a completely different picture, should not be something that we should allow ourselves to be victims of. Now, having said all of that, I think that we must also not lose sight of the broader question, and that is why is this happening? And I'm sure you want to explore that. But in terms of if you like, the justification narrative, I think we need to be very skeptical about that. And remember, what any politicians, it's not just the Israelis, everybody does this. The Iranians do it, everybody else. They want us to discuss things that they want us to discuss. And of course, right now we're discussing Lebanon and we're discussing Iran. What we're not discussing is what is happening elsewhere. In Gaza, nearly 100 people were killed in the last day or so. During a 24-hour period, 71 in one incident and something else. Now, the point, and then of course we've got aerial attacks taking place in the West Bank, roads being ripped up and other things happening. So we're not talking about that. Why have we got Lebanon happening in the first place anyway? People, very smart people in governments are shifting attention. We must not forget the fact that the Israeli prime minister has come under enormous pressure from the US president to come to a ceasefire agreement. And We're not talking about the ceasefire agreement anymore because, for whatever reason, we are now involved in Lebanon. So our attention has been diverted to those issues, whilst other things that we should have been talking about are continuing to happen. So what I'm trying to say is that, Toby, you as a journalist and me as an analyst, we've got to do our job. And that means being led by our thinking, not the thinking of politicians or military leaders.
Okay, well, let me ask one more on this then, and maybe I am being guilty of exactly what you're saying. Maybe I'm being led by what I read, by what I see, and perhaps that is propaganda from Israel. But I do just have one more on this because I think this numbers issue is interesting and not one that I have seen or heard about too much in the coverage of this. And you mentioned there that Iran and Hezbollah have said, we don't target civilians, and that perhaps, when you think of the Iranian rocket attack on Israel, they were successful in that. Israel would argue that they target their own civilians, of course, by sort of embedding themselves amongst the wider public within Gaza in terms of Hamas, within Lebanon in terms of Hezbollah. Um, do you see that as A, being true, and B, being partially responsible for the increased numbers of casualties by Israeli attacks compared with those coming from Iran or Iranian backed militia groups?
Well, Israel has used this argument that because Hamas and Hezbollah live amongst the people in the buildings, we have to destroy those buildings. Um, well, it very much depends on what you believe as an individual the value of life is worth. In international law, as far as I'm aware, having been trained in it for warfare, having been a military commander myself, it is not legal. That's what we were told. You cannot say, well, there is a legitimate target in this building, and just because there are 5, 10 people there, in some cases 100 people in a residential block who are innocent, I can kill people just to get to that legitimate target. You can say that if you do not treat those people's lives as equal. And we've had many instances. I was a target of the IRA for a long time when I was in the military. I might still be the target of the IRA. The point is, we knew in many occasions when an IRA suspect who had been involved in a killing, bombing, we knew not just the address he was living in, but the room he was in. We could easily have dropped an inert bomb and killed them. We could have shot through the window and killed them. We didn't because there was a tiny remote chance, a very remote chance that somebody else might die. And we value human life quite rightly. And every time the Russians attack a building and there's a pregnant woman that's taken out in Ukraine, we quite rightly are shocked. But when hundreds of people are killed, there is some form of euphoric admiration for the way the Israelis can simultaneously drop 3 residential building towers simultaneously and say, wow, isn't that impressive? Um, oh, yeah, there were a few kids in there. It's very much, I'm not going to justify everything. It's very much what you and I believe a human life is worth. If it's not one of our people, it's not worth the same. Well, that may well be true for some, but for many people it isn't. And certainly for the rest of the world, and this is an important point, and I want to make a personal observation here based on my experience. I have never in my life known the Western world to be so insular and so out of step with the rest of the world. And one of the dramatic things this conflict has done is to undermine the United States and, by extension, Europe's moral authority. I fear that it is irrecoverable. And I think that that is one of the big byproducts linked to this. And this is an important point. Linked to this is the fact that for decades, the United States has stood by Israel in its wars, unquestionably. But every time the United States' own regional interests were being threatened, the president, whether it's Reagan or Bush, has said stop and has been able to get the prime minister of Israel to stop within hours. In this incident, since the beginning of this year, I can think of about a handful of occasions when the president of the United States had said, don't do this or do this. And in every case, he's been treated with extreme rudeness and ignored. And the opposite of his request or command or instruction has been done. Now, what we're seeing here is the most powerful man or office in the world being powerless against the head of state of a small country. The nation that was supporting the nation is now being led by the nation it was being supporting. Now, this little penny is just dropping. And I wonder what the long-term consequences would be. And I would stick my neck out that right now we're seeing the beginning of a reappraisal of the relationship between the United States and Europe and Israel. And that is going to have a recalibration. Never before in the history of warfare or conflict has a proxy, if you like, small nation dictated and almost certainly frustrated and almost dictated the policy, the foreign policy interests of the greater nation. The United States, the ripples of this in terms of United States influence across the world, but particularly in the Middle East, we are only just beginning to see. I think it's going to have grave long-term consequences. And for the sake of the Western world's own interests, we need to recover the moral high ground, both in terms of international law, in terms of ethics, in terms of humanity, and in terms of power. And we can't do this if the current situation continues.
In terms of the protection of people, there's been a lot of talk, hasn't there, that Iran warned Israel via the United States, via the United Kingdom, that the missile strikes were on their way. First of all, there seem to be different reports as to whether that happened and whether it was actually in Western intelligence that realized as opposed to being warned. So A, I guess, do you know, or do you have a sense which of those two cases are correct? And then B, if they did warn Israel via the US or UK, then what was that play about? And if they didn't, would you say that Iran is now fully involved in this conflict?
I don't have any special access to information, but I can see that both of those scenarios are equally true. There is a report, I think it's pretty reliable, that the British embassy in Tehran is in contact, obviously, with the regime, and the regime in Tehran are talking to the British embassy, and through the British embassy, they're talking to the Americans. And I think what was said was that we are going to retaliate. We're going to retaliate soon. And almost certainly the report that we got just hours before the attack, in fact, was that they have detected, intelligence has detected an attack is on its way. And you can do that through satellite imagery. ballistic missiles have a particular infrared light signature, heat signature, which is picked up and can be picked up almost instantaneously. And certainly you can get minutes of warnings. And I think we're talking about nearly 12 minutes of warning in this particular instance. Roughly, it's people have different estimates. So the point I'm making is that I think both of those things are true. And we've also had a report that I think, again, through the British Embassy to the Americans, saying from the Iranians, saying that if Israel now retaliates, because according to the Iranians, we've had one each, it's 15 love, if you like, because Israel attacked Iran's embassy in Syria, and Iran responded. Israel attacked its sovereign airspace and carried out an extrajudicial killing during a ceremony to mark the new president, designed wonderfully to humiliate Iran. And of course, they feel they responded to that with a suitably extravagant show of force that hasn't resulted in any civilian casualties to Israeli citizens, but to a Palestinian. And they feel, and they've said as much, that that's it. We're not going to go any further. But if Israel escalates, then of course they're saying that all bets are off. Now, we have to bear in mind that what President Biden, what the Ayatollahs in Tehran say, or whatever any other head of state says, what the one person who is driving this thing has had a personal obsession over, I think, nearly 3 decades about attacking Iran. He has been, this is Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been trying for decades to convince the United States of America to attack and destroy Iran's capacity to threaten the US in any way. What he now realizes, and I'm pretty certain he's an intelligent man, that he will never get this opportunity again. And so he's got to take it, because if he doesn't take it, nobody will probably ever attack Iran again, given their show of force and their threat of even greater force. So we've got this horrible situation where Prime Minister Netanyahu, having created this threat, having created this need in other people's mind, and particularly in his own mind, this obsession, that he must now do the job, or he will never get the chance ever again. And of course, this will threaten his credibility in the longer term. So we've got a very unfortunate situation. And I don't think anybody, certainly President Biden, is in a position to dissuade him.
Yeah, that's interesting because we have had these quotes, haven't we, in the last 24 hours from Joe Biden, who says he believes all-out war can still be avoided. I take it you don't agree. And I'm interested to know as well what you see all-out war as being in the Middle East, because we've already got, Israeli boots on the ground in Lebanon, literally one country invading another. We've got Iran sending missiles into Israel. Literally 3 countries sort of, in various ways invading each other. If that's not all-out war, then what is for the Middle East?
Well, that's a very good question, and it goes to deeper questions about the nature of war. And I think clearly we have presidents in the United States thinking all-out war is something very different, because he's got a military capability that's completely different from other people's military capabilities. The military capability of the Lebanese state, the military capability of Hezbollah, and the military capability of Israel are very different. And their concept of warfare is therefore very different. And this is one of the other major problems that I touched on at the beginning of this interview, of understanding. You can define the world in your own terms, but if the other side sees it differently, then you're in big trouble. I think there's a very famous saying by the Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu, that if you don't know yourself, and if you don't know the enemy, you're going to suffer in almost every single war. But I mean, I'm just misquoting him, but you've got to know yourself and you've got to know your enemy, and you will succeed every time. And we haven't in the last few wars. From Vietnam onwards, the world's greatest superpower in history has failed in every single war strategically because it hasn't understood the enemy, and to some degree it doesn't understand itself as well. It's a great tragedy. Nobody wants, I certainly don't want, the demise of the United States as a great power. But if it doesn't reappraise its own idea of the other as well as itself, it is bound to fail. So yes, we have a situation where we might sit around and say, well, it's not all out war yet. We can put it back. Another, I think, much more pragmatic area in this is the concept of warfare as far as Israel and, of course, the United States support has always been iterative, um, taking a situation, taking it to the brink, and then pushing back, waiting a few years, finding another situation, expanding, and coming back. And that has been a very successful strategy. Israel has done well out of it. Its territorial expansion has increased. Its relative security has increased. The relative power of most of its adversaries has reduced. Politically, it has become much more influential, and we can see this right now. Militarily, it's become much more dominant, and we can see this now. And it's learned from its mistake. Its intelligence capabilities awesome. What that has done is reinforce this idea that we are still in control, that yes, we can just take it to another stage because we haven't got to the really awful stage of all-out war. So we can allow the Israelis to go and do another attack as long as they don't hit nuclear facilities. I think Iranians will be happy with that, and so on. Those are judgments that are prone to error, and and no war, even the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, which in relative terms was a great deal simpler, and the United States had control over. Even there, they miscalculated almost on a monthly basis, and that is why they failed. And what I worry is that these crazy conceptions of what is all out war and what isn't all out war are going to cause problems. The real issue, I don't think, and I'm pretty certain President Biden is aware of this, and nobody's really talking about it. All out war means, I think, in their mind, a collapse of the stable structures in the Middle East. There's unstable structures, Iraq and other places, of course, Lebanon, but there are stable structures, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and many other countries. What's going to happen there? The common people throughout the region, throughout Africa, and throughout Asia are appalled by what they see as an enormous injustice and an unfair application of warfare and law. And there will come a time, if this continues, that the regimes that are stable, that are prosperous, that are very responsible, not just for the prosperity of their own people, but for the rest of the world, will succumb to more radical elements. And here I'm not talking about an uprising like we had in Egypt, but much more likely a prince or a general thinking, look, I can't, in all conscience, allow this to happen on my doorstep. Innocent women and children being butchered because people treat them as subhuman, because they will identify them the same way. They understand the children's language when they scream, and they see this in the eyes of their own children, just as British and American reporters were understandably moved when they saw blonde and blue-eyed children, that's the language they use, crying because they were being evacuated during the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict. So we mustn't think this is some sort of foreign view. Western European journalists were moved by the plight of blonde, blue-eyed kids. Don't for a second think that there aren't generals, princes, even kings who have come to a point where they cannot take this anymore. That's, I think, what President Biden and others think all out war will be: complete chaos in the Middle East. And I think they believe they're away from it. I hope they're right. But certainly, unless they do something significant in the next few hours, and certainly unless they roll back from this, yes, Israel, you can go ahead as long as it's calibrated. The chances are, and the Iranians have said that they will attack in greater force. That will give Prime Minister Netanyahu the green light and justification to go back with even more force. So you can see the escalation already before us. So somebody's got to call time out now, and I don't see this, certainly at the moment.
Afzal, I've got just one more question for you. I really appreciate your time. I think probably this is a longer chat than both you or I anticipated. So thank you for that. But just one more, and it's an area that I don't think I've seen discussed in anywhere that I have seen or heard talk about this Middle Eastern conflict at the moment, and that is, so much talk about Iran and when, if at all, can they produce a nuclear weapon. A very quick Google tells me that Israel has maybe between 90 to 120 nuclear warheads. Do you think there is ever a case where Benjamin Netanyahu feels that taking it to that level is something he either wants or needs to do? And why do we never hear that being talked about? Is this just going back to the sort of propaganda war that you've been talking about? Or is there much more to it? Is there more intelligence that suggests it just simply wouldn't happen?
I think there is no case for those weapons to be used, but there is a very realistic scenario when they will be used. And I'm so glad you asked this question. Because if we get into this escalation that we've been talking about, let's say Israel decides that it's now, tomorrow, the day after, okay for it to go and attack Iranian targets. Let's say they abide for the first time by President Biden's warnings and they don't attack its nuclear facilities. They attack maybe its oil infrastructure, whatever. Iran has said it will retaliate, and let's say they're true to their promise and they retaliate in even greater force. That is going to certainly increase the likelihood of innocent Israelis being killed. Even if it's only half a dozen, the fact is innocent Israelis are killed, and then Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to be seen to be doing something. Now, even if he still avoids the nuclear facilities and says, I must do what many of his people have been saying in public to make sure that Iran can never do this again, he will need to target Iran's underground stocks. Those are not just dug into tunnels, but they're dug horizontally into mountains. And no bunker buster can get at them. The only way he can send out a destructive and deterrent message is to use those nuclear weapons. Now, this is for you and me, and one of the reasons that it's not being talked about is we can't conceive of a scenario. We only conceive of nuclear weapons in the Cold War context. Most recently, President Putin has been talking about them, and he's been dismissed. nobody can imagine a nuclear war. It's just something that only America can do in cases like the Second World War, and we've forgotten about the availability of nuclear weapons and how attractive they may be to certain types of leaders. If Israel does that, and it can feel confident because there is no retaliation from Iran, nuclear retaliation, and whatever retaliation Iran comes up with, he's going to get automatic support from the US. The US next time round will certainly have twice or three times the number of ships in the region, three times the number of aircraft to shoot down three or four times the number of Iranian missiles. The Air Force, Royal Air Force will be there too. So he has nothing to lose. And that is a very dangerous calculation, because the reason nuclear weapons haven't been employed in the past is because of the MAD concept, the mutually assured destruction concept. So you've got a situation here where there is, in his mind at least, assured survival. Why wouldn't he use them? Because it does the job. It destroys the Iranian capability. And this is a government that has shown no moral restraint in that respect. The Israeli soldiers are posting videos of torture, of all sorts of illegal behavior, killing unarmed civilians on social media without any restraint whatsoever, because they feel there's a sense of impunity, there's a sense of immunity for them. And so I think we have to understand that psychological thinking in the regime's mind, and certainly in Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind. And so the question you raise about the possibility of Israel's nuclear arsenal coming into being is a very serious one. And the very fact that people aren't talking about it makes it even more serious. Even more serious. There is an assumption that they won't be used. Well, if you've got them, you've got them for a purpose. And again, I go back to, this is the first and last chance Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to deal with the question that he has been talking about publicly to the UN and elsewhere, that Iran must be eliminated in its current form. It must never be in a position to threaten, to oppose Israel. Nobody else in the region can. They just have to suck it up, and you can see the frustration if you go to the speeches of King Hussein and others, King Abdullah rather, and others in the region to the UN last week. They're really upset, but there's nothing they can do. They just have to accept the reality on the ground. And Iran is the only country in the region that hasn't understood this and is opposing Israel. And that is something Israel cannot accept. And the nuclear weapons use has to be a realistic option. I hope that sort of answers your question. I know there are other issues that you've talked about, but I wanted to just flesh it out a bit, because until we understand the thought process, we can't really appreciate the likelihood of those weapons being used.